Impulse, the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone. I'm happy about every listener, no matter who you are. It's great that you're here, that you're joining us. Yes, our podcast has now been running for over half a year. More than 30 episodes have already been released and the number of listeners keeps growing. I'm absolutely thrilled about that. So, what do I want to talk about today? We're basically heading into the world of business together with politics. So, I've called it the German economy at a crossroads. The state and entrepreneurship are rubbing up against each other. What role do values play? In this episode, I'd like to take a look at the situation in Germany. The world is changing rapidly, and at what used to be, you have to say, the showcase location of Germany. An entrepreneurial crisis is brewing, you could definitely say that. Why are companies leaving the country, or at least many of them? And above all, what can we do about it? Complaining doesn't help, but a good analysis is also important. Together with you, I'd like to bring a bit of clarity to the topic and point out important values, because that's our nexus, always our connection, to add impulses about values here. How am I going to break it down? I'll start by briefly touching on the topics that are relevant in this context. Not to go into great depth, but to lay them out in a way that shows just how complex the situation is and that there aren't any simple, blanket solutions, despite what some populists might actually demand. So, it's a bit like jumping from one thing to another here. Touching on the topics. In the second part, I'll talk about the consequences, but also the possibilities. What can be done, which values need to be strengthened, and which negative values need to be pushed back, in order to wrap things up with a brief conclusion. So, here we go. Tense economic and political situation in Germany, that's one way to put it. And ultimately, it's also tense on a societal level. What do we see as typical, let's say, topics that come up in the media here? Too much bureaucracy is criticized here, and that's certainly true, especially when you compare it to other countries. Taxes are too high, also true, and you can easily compare that with numbers. Not enough skilled workers. That's on everyone's lips. I think officially, there are 1 million open positions. And if you include the unreported ones and estimate, you're looking at 2 million. Of course, that's partly due to demographics, but there are other factors that play a role as well. High energy costs are an important aspect, which, of course, have become even more relevant since the war in Ukraine. And it doesn't look like that's going to drop to a level like we see in even other European countries. Then there are other topics when it comes to politics, like debt. There's often talk about the debt brake and so on. And people say it should be reformed or, better yet, abolished altogether. So, I'll make my opinion clear here, no debt brake. If the relevant people keep going down that path, we'll be doing a great disservice to future generations. Politics operates on a short-term cycle. People want to get re-elected and want to be able to show quick results. But the debt that accumulates over years, even decades, and reduces or at least limits the options that future generations will have. So, I'm really relieved that we actually have the debt brake in place and that it works. Other European countries don't have it. Because of this, we are also, to some extent, a guarantor of the euro stability. In this context, I also recommend a pioneer briefing on the economy with Professor Lars Feld and Justice Hawkap, who always deal with these topics very competently. Yes, skilled workers, as I mentioned earlier, is very much connected to migration. And here, citizens simply want this to be regulated and to take place in a sensible way. Not as many people are actually against migration as is often claimed. But they are against uncontrolled immigration. And if we only have immigration into the social welfare system and not into the labor market, then I think that's a mistake, and that's simply not what the public wants. So if, in Denmark, 70% of Ukrainian refugees are employed, but here it's only 17%, then you really have to ask yourself if there isn't something else we could be doing. And of course, this just adds fuel to the fire for the populists, the right-wing populists, but as we all know, there are also left-wing populists. And populism is something that's sometimes dismissed a bit, but it's actually a very, very serious danger. To reference the values scholar Hartman here, he said that the virus of war ultimately begins with the division of society. It starts when we see otherness, that is, when someone else has different beliefs, and we, so to speak, hate them. When we ignore or even fight them, that's when we divide society. We introduce the divisive element that leads to hatred and, in the end, to serious internal conflicts and ultimately to war. So we need this tolerance, the kind where we actually respect otherness and engage with it. And that's also, to some extent, the crisis we're facing in democracy, because people have the impression, and it's true, you can't deny it, that politics isn't able to handle these many challenges or simply can't manage them. And that's what has triggered the crisis of liberal democracy. We're not the only ones, but we are certainly a vivid example. And that's why autocracies are also gaining a bit more traction in our world. That means many people are willing to give up some of their freedom, just so that at least things are handled properly from the top and actually get done. But that can't be the answer, after all. I mean, of course the challenges are enormous. I've already mentioned a few of them. And then, on top of that, there's climate change and the infrastructure, which is in a pretty dilapidated state. But at the same time, we can certainly say that we're maintaining a welfare state that's become so bloated by now that it just can't be right anymore. I mean, the other European countries are practically lining up to pass the refugees on to us. And they want to come here too, because it's also the easiest here to get money. And I'll say it very clearly, citizens' income. For me, that's the wrong name. It's basically like a basic income that everyone has a right to. And it's been scientifically proven that this doesn't work. And it's not fair either. If we value personal responsibility, or responsibility in general, then it can't be right that I can just say, I'm not going to do anything, that's my decision, and then I get money for it. So, I think we really need to be very careful here. We've created a system that's so bloated in this area that it's not even worth working anymore. And that's the economic calculation behind it. This leads to the state ultimately competing with social assistance, Bürgergeld, against the open positions in the economy because people, from an economic point of view, quite rightly say, no, before I work 40 hours a week for low pay, I'd rather just take the social assistance. And maybe one more point here, that's the issue of subsidies. The state is, of course, someone who, in certain situations, has to provide relief for transitions. Back then, the transition in the coal mining regions wasn't easy either. But by now, this has really ballooned. And that does raise the question, how much arbitrariness do we have here versus justice? And subsidies go to those who put in the most effort, who also invest time. I'll say a bit more about that later, in order to actually get them. But this time isn't really invested productively in the company's business purpose, but rather just to get something from the government. And that really shouldn't be the case. And Ludwig Erhard, the founder of the social market economy, put it very nicely. He summed it up by saying that the framework conditions need to be set by the government so that a playing field is created where social and market can operate together. And from Pioneer, I also got this nice image from Gabor Steingart. According to Ludwig Erhard, The state is actually supposed to be a kind of referee, basically moving around the football field and making sure things go smoothly without any fouls. But right now, it looks like the referee, the state, has put on a jersey and wants to play along and score the goals themselves. And at the same time, it also starts changing the rules of the game, which leads to people not really knowing how they're supposed to play anymore. And ultimately, chaos breaks out. So, these are all factors that put a strain on the German economy, on businesses, and also on the population. On top of that, there are the geopolitical difficulties, the wars we're facing, the rampant inflation, and it's not. It's not being brought under control, that's right, and there are also uncertainties within the European Union, where cohesion is now at risk. If we look at countries like Hungary or what's happening now in Slovakia and so on, it's really not encouraging. So, numerous German companies are cutting jobs in order to invest more abroad. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. A few names, steel, for example, everyone knows Miele, Bosch, are just a few examples I could mention. But there are many, many more, the so-called hidden champions, all those mid-sized companies that are doing really, really well worldwide in all sorts of industries. And of course, they're now also saying that bureaucracy and, above all, other location factors are getting worse. I've got two sources for you. I've picked them out for you, they'll be in the show notes, one from Handelsblatt and one from Berliner Zeitung. So if you're interested, you can check them out and get straight to the point. So that's part one, diving in here, what topics are we dealing with, and what exactly does the problem look like? And I can say, it's challenging, but we have to make it work. And unfortunately, politics at the moment isn't where we'd like it to be. So, what are the consequences, and what options do we have? Here's a little anecdote from my own company. Last year, we applied for a grant, and we have a fantastic employee who really put in a huge effort here. We developed a new tool, a psychometric one. He really put together an application that was fantastic, and I didn't have to do all that much. Anyway, we submitted it, made one revision, and then we got the official notice saying, yes, it's eligible for funding, and we thought, great, we've won. And it was at least a mid-sized 5-figure amount, which is really a great thing for my small business. And we were super happy, until at some point the tax office said again, no, you have to apply for it in a completely different way. For one fiscal year, basically a business year, calendar year, and then for the other one. And of course, we did that too and kept everything properly separated, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly, they said, nope, well, for this second business year, you won't be getting the funding. Yeah. Why? Well, and then somewhere in a huge document, in the fine print, it says you have to have a very specific capital ratio. And if you don't have that, you don't get it. Bottom line, there's nothing you can do about it. We got it for one business year, but not for the second. So they said, the funding that we, in my opinion, worked hard for, has been cut by 50%. That doesn't mean it's been paid out yet, not by a long shot. If you think it's that simple, no, it'll eventually be offset against your next tax payments. All I can say is, it's uneconomical in every way, and in the end, it was for us too, because we put a lot of time into it, even afterwards. And uneconomical, in my opinion, for the government as well, considering how many people were involved in checking everything. I don't even want to know how much was ultimately spent on that, and for me, it always comes back to this point. Folks, we can't have the government look at everything and then approve it all. And that's just the beginning. That's paternalism. In the end, that's basically a planned economy, if you want to call it that. Instead, we need to think from the supply side, with a supply-oriented approach. So we need to say, look, if you, dear company, are investing here at this location, in this sector, with this technology, Then we promise you that you'll pay less tax on XYZ for 5 years, that you can write off your investment faster, whatever the case may be. But then it's very clear, when it comes to battery technology for cars or artificial intelligence for, I don't know what else, then I don't need a bunch of bureaucrats checking everything. The situation is clear. And that's the difference with the so-called Green Deal of the EU, and the European Union is really focused on the fact that, while programs are launched, the disbursement of these funds, the programs are provided with substantial resources, is strictly controlled, and that everything always has to be applied for. So, the government puts money in somewhere as a budget. And then the companies have to come and get their share out of it. The US does it the other way around. In their Inflation Reduction Act, as it's officially called, which is actually a huge investment program, they say, look, if you invest here and there, according to very clear guidelines, then you'll get a certain amount of special depreciation and a certain amount of tax savings. And that's what supply-side orientation means. And in this respect, for Germany's future, it's absolutely crucial that the government and the economy need to work well together. And I get the impression that this has gotten out of balance. And what values are at stake in this context? Of course, it's about responsibility, specifically, the responsibility of each individual. And recently, I also heard a great suggestion regarding bureaucracy. The issue always comes up, now we need a regulation for this too, and then you have a reporting obligation. And here we have a supply chain law. And in the end, what does that lead to? That companies suddenly have more work, which means suddenly more costs, because these requirements have to be met. And that, of course, leads to lower profits. And so there's a demand somewhere that if the government introduces a new reporting obligation like this, then it should also pay for it or grant a tax break for it. So, a shifting of the burden, because I think it's just too easy for politicians to simply say, that's how it's going to be now. And it's always the companies that are supposed to bear it, which really isn't fair, so you have to say, all right, dear politicians, if you're going to impose these reporting requirements, then you basically need to budget for them as well. Because otherwise, in the end, you'll end up suffocating the companies, and I recently read an article that made this point very clear. It was about a medium-sized, craft-based business, and it calculated that if this company were to properly fulfill all the reporting requirements, then it wouldn't be able to carry out its actual business purpose anymore. And that can't be the point, after all. So, Germany as a business location has to remain, or once again become, attractive for companies and investments, because we're already in a slow decline, and that's going to cost us our prosperity. And yes, politics tends to act from one moment to the next. But if we look at this over decades, things don't look good. Yes, so we need digitalization. Yes, we need to cut red tape, but we also need creativity from a values perspective. How can we achieve that? Drive, courage. And above all, in my opinion, we also need more sense of community. So, we really need to make sure that we move towards a supply-oriented approach so that government control can be scaled back because the state simply can't handle it. We need personal responsibility, and that requires self-leadership, and ultimately, we need the freedom to act. So, as you can see, the values we work with here at Profiling Values have a lot to do with exactly that, in the end. Let me wrap up with a conclusion. We are currently in a difficult time due to the various factors I mentioned. I was born in the 60s. I can honestly remember decades when things were a lot easier. But there's no guarantee that will always be the case. And that's why, when we find ourselves in these phases, in times like these, we have to try to get through them. And my conclusion is that we can't rely on the government to do it for us. Yes, we have to try to ensure that the government and businesses work well together. Sure, sometimes it does seem like the government is working against businesses, but I don't think that's intentional. Instead, I think it's because we've ended up with a kind of political class where there's no real crossover between the world of business and politics, and as a result, there are a lot of politicians who have never actually seen the inside of a company. And of course, that's something that leads to a lack of understanding and, as a result, less of it. A sense of community. And my dear colleague Fabian, who also helped prepare this, suggested that I should maybe share a few wishes and thoughts as an entrepreneur here. Share how I personally see things. So, how do I see it? As an entrepreneur, I make mistakes too. Over the past few years, I've made quite a number of mistakes, but now, I think we're really back on track. But I wish the government wouldn't always feel like it's always right. That's the impression you get, also from how the government sets the funding I mentioned, how it sets taxes, how it estimates, how it acts, how it does things. It's always right and it's not empathetic. And that's why I always have this saying in mind: German entrepreneurship isn't successful because of the government, but in spite of it. Yeah, and if we look around Europe or elsewhere, there are countries that simply do it better. Let me name a few. Norway, for example. Sure, people say they have oil, but that's not the only reason. The Netherlands also do it better, Switzerland as well, just look over there. Denmark, our northern neighbor, Estonia, a fully digitalized country, and even Canada, and so on. I could really keep adding to the list. So my wish would be for the government to also cut back on itself. To stop inflating its own positions, to stop playing the savior, to stop acting as if it's responsible for everything. And that means, in turn, that we as a society need to strengthen values like personal responsibility, solidarity, and a sense of community. This internal locus of control, that we can shape things ourselves, from within, and not just sit back and say, well, the government has to fix it for us. The government is necessary, but it has grown into a role that it simply can't handle, to put it that way. And that's why I would hope for some self-restraint, but that only works if society and the business world demand it loudly enough and also deliver accordingly from their side. So, to wrap up, please feel free to leave a rating on Spotify or in your podcast player, and be sure to follow Profiling Values on LinkedIn. I would really appreciate it. And now, of course, I'm also glad that you stuck around until the end. And of course, I'm looking forward to the next episodes of our podcast, Wordy Impulse, the podcast for potential development.